right, standardization is mad important, yo. It's super vital. So if you're doing high intensity training or you're natural or both, even more important. I mean, you got to leverage progressive overload on high intensity. You can't properly progress if you're not standardized. If you're a gearhead or you're doing volume, it's still really important, but it is more so for high intensity naturals. So anyway, let's get into it. So the first thing is ascertaining honest progression. So if you're not standardizing your exercises, you're not going to know whether or not you're honestly progressing or falsely regressing, etc. So super important, numero uno, is to ascertain whether or not what you're doing is correct by ascertaining if you're progressively overloaded. And this is extremely important, again, reiterate, for naturals. It is the most important if you are natural to be progressively overloading. So standardization is a key to natural progressions or proper progressions. Already made a video a few days ago about how to properly progressively overload on high intensity. Go watch it if you haven't. And this is part of that series, I suppose, is progressive overload, standardization being the most important aspect of it. First way to make sure your reps or exercises are standardized is full range of motion. If you are varying your range of motion from a session to session or rep to rep basis, it's impossible to know if you're progressively overloading. If one week you are squatting ass to grass and then the next week you're squatting, say, quarter of the way ass to grass, you're going to be lifting significantly more weight than last week. All of a sudden you think, wow, I progressively overloaded so good. I'm awesome. I'm doing shit so well. Nah, you might be fucking up. You might not even be progressing at all. You're just increasing the range of motion. Or on the flip side, you might be progressing, but you don't know it because you're falsely regressing because you went from a parallel squat last session because you like, powerlifting squats. And now today you're doing slightly below parallel, maybe 2 inches below parallel. And all of a sudden you can't lift what you lifted last week, let alone progress. And all of a sudden you think what you're doing is wrong. You think you're fucking up your sleep or your nutrition or your training or whatever. But in reality, you just fucked up your range of motion. Whereas if you went through an entire range of motion every single time, because it is impossible to keep the range of motion exactly the same every single rep, let alone every single session. If you just went through the same range of motion every time, you would know whether or not you're progressing honestly, maintaining or regressing. That way you know if you need to now address something. If you're progressing, cool. If you're maintaining, maybe not so cool. If you're regressing, definitely not cool. Something needs to be fixed. So full range of motion on everything. Same with a bench press, same with a barbell curl, anything. And if you want to do, say, a quarter squat, for example, do a box squat. Go to parallel, but on a box. That way it's the exact same range of motion every time, because an inch can make all the difference in your leverages and your strength, and you'll falsely regress and progress based off that. So full range of motion has nothing to do with the argument of, fucking partials versus full ROM. What's better for building muscle? I don't give a fuck. It's about whether or not you're standardizing your exercise through doing the exact parameter every single time. Which leads me to the next one, which is no cheating. Same boat. If you're cheating your reps, you don't know if you're actually progressing or regressing because you cannot cheat exactly the same every time. You're doing a cheat curl, you might cheat 5 extra kilos with your spinal erectors 1 rep. Then the next rep, you might use a little bit, even more spinal erectors, and all of a sudden you've added 8 kilos of resistance for your spinal erectors. If you're doing a cable row, maybe you're only cheating a little bit, but even just a tiny little bit of cheat can make all the difference when you're doing cheat form. If you're using, say 70 kilos and you're doing strict form on the cable row, and then you go and try this, go to the gym and try this. Do strict form, see how much weight you can get with your retrospective strength level, then use a bit of momentum the next set, you're going to get significantly more reps or significantly more weight. And this can be all over the place. So keep the reps exactly the same, whether it be range of motion or standardization of strict form. Make sure it's the same, otherwise you'll not know whether or not you're actually honestly progressing or regressing. Then there's mild nuances. Make sure that your rep speed and cadence is exactly the same every single time. If you're doing a bench press and you're doing negatives with, a 3-second control on the way down, make sure every single rep is 3 seconds. Don't make sure the next rep isn't 4 seconds or the next rep after that is 2 seconds, because if you do, say, 1 week where you do the negative for 4 seconds on the bench press and you get 10 reps with a certain weight, next session you go maybe 2 seconds on the way down, all of a sudden you've cut theoretically anywhere between 10 to 20 seconds off your rep speed. And that can mean the difference between significantly more or less weight depending on which way you're going. If you went higher amount of negatives, then all of a sudden you're weaker next week. If you go lower amount of negative time, you're stronger next week. So same thing. You have to make sure that your rep speed is exactly the same. You might be doing a pretty strict tricep extension and you start, not using any momentum to extend your tricep at all. And then you start just using a little bit of jolt of energy to get past that difficult initial resistance curve that comes with the tricep extension. And all of a sudden you can do significantly more weight than last time. So and I've done this so many times. I've trained 3 months at a time, and then I cross-reference my form from months ago, and I go, wow, I fucking started using cheat form here. I didn't even progressively overload. What the fuck happened here? And this is recent, and this is me trying to be conscious of it. So make sure that everything is exactly the same. That way, you're progressing properly. Next is machines over free weights. Machines require less technical requirement, they require less stabilization. Stabilization muscles is nonsense. You can get the same amount of growth from machines that you get from free weights. Stable muscles, these muscles that just seemingly are there to stabilize don't exist. You're just recruiting every motor neuron or you're not. And machines make it harder to cheat too. You can cheat on a machine, granted, but it is harder. They set you in place, they make sure everything is pretty well standardized every single time. If you're doing a standing overhead press, for example, very technical movement, requires a hell of a lot of muscle tissue to do, and there's a lot of things to think about. When you're doing a standard overhead press, you have to make sure that you're not using any leg drive, because even a centimeter of leg drive can make you significantly stronger, because the quads are very big, strong muscles. You have to make sure your core's tight, make sure you're tucked back, make sure the barbell is going just closer to your face as possible without touching it, making sure you're poking your head through at the top. And then there's a bunch of stabilization involved and a bunch of technique involved that could change your strength level rep to rep. You go from blasting out one rep, and then the next rep you're like, oh fuck, I misgrooved. Oh shit, did I get weaker or stronger? I can't tell because it wasn't standardized. Whereas you do a total opposite end of the spectrum with a machine overhead press, there is none of that involved. You're sitting, so you don't have to stabilize your core, you're not using leg drive, and the range of motion or the movement pattern is exactly the same every time because it's set in stone. Or a Smith machine, set in stone. Now, you could use kind of a midway here with dumbbells, for example, like a seated dumbbell overhead press. It's not a machine movement, but it's significantly easier to standardize than a standing overhead press or a fucking like clean and jerk. Like, if you're doing clean and jerk for bodybuilding, you're fucking dumb because it's so much technique involved. There's so many things that can change from a rep to rep basis. If you want to just make pure hypertrophy and pure strength gains, try to use as much machine as you can because that will keep everything super standardized. Next is the subconscious and your ego tricking you. Your brain wants to progressively overload like it did 10 years ago when you first started training. It was fun adding 5 kilos to your squat every session. You no longer can do that. So what you'll do is you'll trick yourself by using a little bit of momentum over time in order to progressively overload falsely a little bit more than if you went strict. And there's a lot of things that go into this. I mean, maybe you watch Larry Wheels a lot and you see him, a genetic freak on steroids, adding 100 pounds to his bench press in fucking 3 months and you go, fuck, I definitely am not doing that. That's depressing. Let me trick myself into adding more weight over time because my ego cannot take the fact that I'm not that fucking strong and I'm not progressing that fast. Well, the problem with that is you'll never really progress anywhere anyway because you will not know if you're progressing. And you won't build as much muscle because you're not going to have as much tension on the muscles you're looking to build. So make sure that you're conscious when you're in the gym. This happens to me even to this day where I'll start using more and more cheating, just like tiny little nuances. But on a long enough continuum, if I add a centimeter of momentum every single session, all of a sudden I'm adding 5 to 10 centimeters of momentum by the end of the year. So stay conscious, make sure that you're not being tricked by your ego and keep everything exactly the same. Progress slows down, progress eventually becomes slow, but that's okay. You don't have to trick yourself by using shitty form to falsely progress. Next is how to have fun and how to cheat. So using cheat form can be fun and it gets a bit neurotic having to make sure everything is exactly the same every time. So there is a time and place. If you have done your initial set to failure, let's say you're doing a barbell bicep curl to failure. You keep going until you get to the point where you can't lift it. I'm failing. Fuck, I didn't get it. Cool. Now, throw in 2 or 3 cheat reps beyond failure if you'd like to. Use a bit of momentum to now get that barbell up and do a slow eccentric or a slow negative beyond failure like Dorian Yates, like Mike Mensah, like a high intensity guy. That's fine. But don't start the set off with cheating form because again, you won't know. You guessed it, if you're standardized. So cheat after you've done your standardized, clean, consistent repetitions, but don't cheat before that point. Fail first, then have fun with it if you like. I don't personally do this much because I don't know, I just don't see the point. But if you want to, by all means, go for it. Second last one is no one's perfect, but try your best. I mean, obviously, you're not going to be able to make everything 100% perfect. It's very fucking difficult to keep standardization exact. You might do a 3-second negative followed up by a 4-second negative the next rep. And that's out of your control because maybe you're just not very good at counting. Or maybe you're just not fully there that day. And you start kind of using a bit of momentum or you're not doing full range of motion, and that's okay. So you can't always be perfect, but if you stack all these things, no cheating, no mild nuances, use more machines, use more exercises that require less skill, full range of motion, you stay conscious. That's the biggest thing with standardization. It's just stay conscious. You're going to be far closer to perfect than if you just go in there willy-nilly not giving a shit about any of this. So stay conscious. You might get maybe 95, 98% of the way there perfect, and that's perfectly reasonable for making sure that progression is standardized. You don't have to be perfect, just close enough that you can actually, within a decent degree of certainty, that you are actually progressing and not falsely progressing. Get rid of the noise as much as you can. So yeah, just try your best and you'll be fine. Now, last but not least is safety. It is safer to do full range of motion than it is to do partials and then one day go full range and all of a sudden your muscles and tendons can't take that load at that range of motion and you potentially hurt yourself. It is far safer not to do cheat form. It is safer not to use a bunch of momentum on a bicep curl and use weight that your bicep and your bicep tendon cannot be loaded with. It is safer to use machines than it is with free weights. It is safer to do slow controlled negatives than it is to do really quick non-fucking standardized reps like a retard. And then it's also safer to keep your form standardized. Form's another big one. I kind of left this one out, but last but not least, I guess, is safety within form. If you're doing a deadlift, you might find that within the first 5 reps of your deadlift, you can keep a neutral spine. Then by the 6th rep, you can still lift it, but you can't keep a neutral spine because your spinal erectors are no longer strong enough to maintain neutral spine. And you keep lifting, and all of a sudden, you are no longer safe because you didn't keep the form standardized. And then all of a sudden, you start using more and more bent spine on a weekly basis to get more out of your deadlifts. You start falsely progressing because you don't need to keep your neutral spine, which is safe. But you don't give a shit about that because your ego wants you to lift more weights. So you're like, all right, fuck it, I'm going with a bent spine because I can lift 15 more kilos with a bent spine. Or maybe you're trying to keep both. Maybe you're like trying to keep a neutral spine, but then occasionally you do a bent spine and all of a sudden, one week you're totally neutral and that's great, you get 5 reps. Then the next week you go straight and then neutral and you get 2 reps beyond that and you're like, oh wow, I progressed. No, you just fucked up your form. So kind of along the same line of cheating, but not cheating with momentum, is kind of just making sure your form is exactly the same every time. Make sure that when you're bench pressing, you're retracted every single time. You're not protracted. When you're doing cable rows, you're retracted, not protracted. Your form is exactly the same too. This will affect standardization also. So, and then, I mean, back to the point, which is safety. If you're shit form, using cheating or your posture's fucked, you're more likely to get injured. So probably one of the bigger points here is that standardization, or being conscious of standardization, will have a cascading effect that will make you safer. Now, I did just tell you that after your initial standardized reps that you can potentially do some cheat reps, but that's the thing. When you do cheat reps after you've done standardized form with weight that you can control safely, you could probably do a few cheat reps with that weight without any decent risk of injury. It's still a bit of a risk, and hence why I don't do cheat reps that much, but it's going to be far less of a risk than if you just initially jumped onto a weight that you couldn't lift strict at all and you just start cheating straight away. Your fucking muscles are not ready for that. That's because they can't lift it, so you shouldn't be using it. You're now having to leverage other muscles to move that joint. No bueno. But if you want to do, a few mild cheat reps after you failed, that's okay. Granted, you're not doing like crazy swinging bicep curls or crazy shit like bending your back for the deadlift beyond that initial neutral spine failure point. You'll be okay. And then maybe like when you do a cheat form, make sure that you're just getting it to the top and then you're doing slow controlled negatives rather than like doing these fucking quick, really fast bicep curls. Take the Dorian Yates approach. Just use a bit of momentum to get to where you're then safe in a slow controlled negative because you're stronger in the negative than you are in the positive. So safety is going to come along with standardization more too. Anyway, that's it for today. Peace out. Bye.